Hey there, this is Mike Merles, and I am once again talking about tabletop role playing games. In this episode, specifically talking about challenge rating and why it is, after 10 plus years of 5th edition, it is a terrible foundation on which to build monsters. So let's start. I could do an entire thing on the history of challenge rating. I am not going to do that. If people really want to hear the history of like where challenge rating came from and why it's defined the way it is, I guess I could talk about that. I'm assuming though that like most people either know that or it's not going to be very useful in terms of you're running the game and trying to figure out like how do I actually make this work. Knowing here's the history of the thing that's broken doesn't necessarily help you. But what I can do is talk a little bit about like challenge rating and why I think it doesn't work and what I am replacing it with. So let's start off with the first concept of what does challenge rating measure. So it measures the power of a creature compared to a party of 4 adventurers. So in theory, now if you've run the game, you're probably saying right now this doesn't work. Okay, but in theory, this is what it's doing. I have a challenge rating for a creature, 4 4th level characters fighting it. Should be like a medium difficulty fight. Now, there are like 3 things in that sentence that are wrong. So first, let's start just with this premise that I have my measure for monsters. Here's my tool I'm going to use to measure a monster's power. Great. And I'm using it to compare it to 4 characters. What happens if there's only 3 people who show up this week? What happens if 5 show up this week? This is just not a great measure to begin with because it's very fragile, and it is also just the very simple thing like, let's say, for instance, I am designing my adventure, and I say, okay, I have 4 players in my party. I am going to throw a CR2 monster at my level 2 party. Wait, someone didn't show up that week. How do I remove a quarter of a single monster? So like right off the bat, we have this really strange balancing mechanism. 1 monster per 4 characters as our default. A more sensible thing to do would be to say whatever measure I'm using compares a monster to a character. So let's say, for instance, if we were to say a challenge rating 2 monster is a threat to a level 2 character, well then, if I have 4 characters that week, I have 4 monsters they fight. If there's 5, I add an extra monster. If there's 3, I take a monster away. So we're already on really shaky and weird ground. Second, if you just take a look at the monster manual, like look at almost any random creature, you can pretty quickly see these things are not designed to actually win 4-on-1 fights. When we think about action economy, the ability of characters to shut down monsters' actions, the party just getting a lot more turns than the monsters, it's just an unfair fight to begin with. So we are in this really weird position where our default is already an unfair matchup, 1 versus 4. But yet, when we look at our design, setting aside legendary creatures, we don't really have as a default mechanisms for monsters to take on that many creatures. If, for instance, we just said, hey, monsters just always take multiple turns, or they have a scaling number of attacks. So, for instance, let's say we took something like an ogre, and it said when the ogre attacks, it attacks every creature within 10 feet once. You could see there's a natural scaling there. But that's not how the game works. The game takes the same structures for characters, the action economy, how attacks work, and applies to the monsters. So my ogre, in this case, gets 1 action. Each attack fires off individually. Its strength score is going to modify its damage. So if I want to try to balance its damage, I also have to count for its strength score, which maybe I set to 18 because that's like flavorful. But now it's +4 to hit and damage. So maybe it should only really be attacking twice per turn, or maybe even once to keep the damage under control. But I've got 4 characters, and I'm trying to like threaten an entire party. The ogre also maybe has an intelligence and wisdom of 8, so it's got some crappy saving throws, especially its wisdom save. But then, of course, if it's just 1 wisdom save, it fails. Like, it's shut down. I've shut down the entire encounter because it's 4-on-1. So there's a lot of issues there. The other side of the coin is this idea of the medium fight. And I believe the actual flaw of the monster design system in 5th edition, and again, this is based on years of playing it. So it took time for this to come out. Is this idea of the medium encounter. So there's a really funny thing that around, over time, 5th edition has become more and more complicated. The time it takes to play the game has gone up. When you look back at the original Player's Handbook in 2014, things like bonus actions had not yet become something where this is now a resource that is part of your action economy. You must be cashing in during a fight for tangible rewards, damage, AC bonus, etc. They really were. It really was just acting as this limiter. Oh, you can't smite and you know cast a spell and attack because we put the bonus action in. You got to pick one of those. The smite's a terrible example because in 24 in 5th edition you could just do it. But anyway, the it really was just kind of acting as a limiter and also helping with multi-classing because it just limited what you could move through. But what's happened now is if you have this medium fight, and it's not going to be threatening, it's going to be a very outlier situation where it actually threatens the players, the time it takes to run that fight is effectively wasted time unless the DM is spending a lot of effort to come up with narrative reasons to keep this fight interesting. It puts a lot of pressure on the DM to make the fight interesting in a system that spends a lot of time and energy trying to do monster design in a way that, hey, the DM can just use the monster and the monster itself should be interesting enough that maybe preps, my prep of just deciding, oh, I'm going to throw a shambling mound in this fight. Well, the shambling mound alone is interesting enough that I don't need to then worry about adding all these other layers. That's what I paid the game designer to do. The shambling mound alone is a fun thing to fight. Well, that doesn't necessarily happen because going back to it's 4-on-1, the monsters aren't necessarily designed that way. But also this idea that if the challenge rating is aiming for a medium fight, and the medium fight is not actually supposed to be threatening, well, now how do I build a hard fight? Because my medium fight's going to take a while. This creature has to take on 4 characters and survive for 3 rounds, so it's got a lot of hit points. There's a lot of stuff going on. And at the same time, the creature itself is only a medium threat. So you may end up with, and I think this is where the design sometimes ends up, you have these creatures with a lot of hit points. It takes forever to knock them down, but the damage they're kicking out is not actually a threat to the party because it's calibrated for a medium difficulty, which then combined with the complexity of the characters means this fight's taking forever and we never actually felt threatened. So that's another angle, which I just think the idea of medium difficulty just doesn't make any sense. And then we have to loop around and say, okay, so we have a creature. It's designed for a medium threat, which I think now we have found out if those medium fights took 10 minutes of real time, they wouldn't be so bad. But they're actually taking more like an hour now. Not that I ever think, they could take 10, but that's a pretty rare group. They're probably more taking 20, 25 minutes. Not so bad that you notice it as much. But now that maybe it's taking an hour, you're definitely noticing it. It's calibrated for this 4 versus 1 fight, which is there might be some groups, but a lot of groups, I'd say the majority of groups probably don't have 4. Maybe 4 is the most common group size, but it's not the majority. Even if it's not the majority, I'd rather have a system that works for everybody because I could just design that. And we have this, once you look at the action economy, because we said monsters have to work like characters, we've now just exacerbated this 4 versus 1 concept because I have to somehow make a player character effectively that can act 4 times, right? Because I'm having to work within that same action economy. Monsters don't as a default just get lots of extra actions. Now, the exception to that is legendary monsters, which is another kind of weird thing about the entire challenge rating system, that I could have it a challenge rating, a legendary creature, and a normal creature. The legendary creature is clearly more powerful because it just gets more actions. Or, I am stuck just taking the power level of that challenge rating and just spreading it like butter on toast across more actions. So now it's I'm fighting the dragon, but it's individually its actions are weaker because it's getting 4. That's also unsatisfying, and so basically legendary creatures are usually calibrated to be more of just a difficult encounter rather than just a medium one. But again, now what does challenge rating mean? Because I have 2 creatures with the same rating and one is tougher than the other, but I have to look at the stat block and see that it's got legendary actions to figure that out. So there's a lot of issues there. Now, then we come around to, and this kind of dovetails off that medium difficulty problem. The medium difficulty is now in a place where it's taking too much time. It's not actually delivering exciting gameplay, and it's baked into this core math flaw of 5th edition, and therefore 5.5, which is, hey, the adventuring day. So the adventuring day is 23 rounds, and it assumes you take, I believe it's 3 short rests over the course of those 23 rounds. That's why, by the way, short rests are 1 hour long, because they weren't meant to be something that you took every encounter, after every encounter. I think looking back, that was strictly a massive mistake. I think short rests should have been something ridiculously short, like a minute or two, and every fight should be calibrated assuming the party short rests after every fight. And here's why. The difference between a fight in which the party burns through their short rest resources and one in which they don't is massive. It's so massive that effectively this is why boss monster fights are very difficult to make work in 5th edition. You already have challenge rating and this weird kind of thing of, okay, it's 4 versus 1, but it's assuming medium, so now you have to go above your challenge rating to find difficult, but how much above? And if you look around online or run the game, you might find like, hey, my 8th level party is routinely fighting CR 18 monsters and winning. And what you're seeing there is a consequence of, if the party is dumping all their resources into a fight, and this isn't necessarily the long rest resources, though that definitely has its role, but the short rest resources alone can account for a massive disparity in power. So let's take a step back and imagine a 3rd level fighter. And let's just use some very simple math here. Let's say if the 3rd level fighter uses none of their short rest resources, that they do, we're going to call it 1 unit of damage across a combat. So they're going to fight for 3 rounds, they don't use anything that they can't claw back, and they're going to do 1 unit of damage. Well, now let's think about if they decide to burn through all of their short rest resources. What does that do? Well, let's say we have a Battle Master. The Battle Master has a set of dice. Starting at level 3, you have 4 superiority dice, and those are 8-sided dice. Let's assume this fighter is using a longsword, and let's assume this fighter has, let's say, a strength 18, or 16, 18, somewhere there, +3 or +4 damage. Roughly speaking, since those dice are usually cashed in for extra damage, we are, across those 4 dice, it's effectively worth 2 extra attacks. The fighter's attacking once per round. We've effectively now increased the fighter's damage by 2/3. But wait, there's more. The fighter also has Action Surge. An Action Surge is an extra turn. Well, I'm assuming 3 turns. So if I am adding an extra turn to that, I'm increasing my damage by another 1/3. Now, this is all a little rough because it depends on the abilities you take, but when you think my superiority dice are increasing my damage by roughly 2/3, and Action Surge is increasing my damage by another 1/3, I've now doubled my damage. I am doing 6 rounds of damage in 3 rounds of combat. It is effectively, a simple case is I have 4 fighters going up against a monster that has been judged. Let's say I'm using my CR. I'm like, okay, this is, it's much higher through experience. I go 6 CR higher. That's actually going to be deadly. Whatever it is, I figured it out. But the party, all 4 of those fighters dump all of their abilities into that one combat. They're now effectively fighting 8 fighters. Like, I've doubled the power of the characters. Now let's take a step back. In our system, we thought 23 rounds of combat. Only 3 short rests. The system is assuming that you're taking all those encounter powers and spreading them like butter across a piece of toast. But in reality, that's not how people play. People play by optimizing their use of their resources in order to defeat an encounter. If an encounter's tougher, that's where they're going to dump all their stuff in. If the encounter's easier, they might dump it in because let's say it's a medium encounter. This is not going to be a threat. Well, why would I use my resources against this encounter? We just have to be patient. Maybe we'll use like some of our healing to just claw back our hit points because maybe we can't short rest yet. But the only reason I'm going to use any of my resources in that medium fight is I want to make this fight end earlier. Maybe because I'm bored, because it's taking forever to finish this fight, and this creature actually isn't much of a threat. So we have this basic chassis of the adventuring day sitting on top of a measure where like almost every side of the equation has, through years of play, just proven, this is not necessarily working the way the designers intended. And maybe the starting point, just kind of inheriting the structure from 3rd edition, was more of like convenience and familiarity than actually building something that is a useful tool for the game. So basically, the way I look at it and the way I've designed and the stuff you'll see that accompanies this, if you're looking at my Patreon, and this will be a free article by the way, so you can just go take a look at it. The is showing off essentially like the core monster design of taking that math behind the game and replotting it with, let's say, a monster of level X is a difficult fight for a character of level X. So let's assume we want dramatic fights. Let's not build in these spacers, which are like, oh, it's going to be an attrition game. Like, no, we want it to be an exciting game, an action game. Every fight is going to matter, and that's simply because rolling back is easier. I can give you guidelines to like use half the monsters for an easy fight, rather than trying to figure out, okay, if I start medium, how do I get you to hard? Well, how do I add half again the monsters? Like again, I want to have an ogre fight the party. How do I add half an ogre? Now you could argue, okay, how do I cut the ogre in half? Well, okay, then maybe I should be using an ogre. But let's start with what we're assuming is the fight that the DM wants, which is something that's worth the time you're going to put into it, rather than something that's just there, like almost like this test of your patience. Are you willing to just not use your abilities to make this fight shorter and grind through it, or are you going to get impatient and start popping off stuff just to kill this stuff faster? So let's assume that, and then let's assume that you're going to short rest after every fight. So now we can calibrate saying, hey, you got all these abilities, you're just going to use them. Like, this also has a knock-on effect of like one thing I've noticed, especially with players who aren't like thinking in terms of the attrition game. Players just want to use their cool stuff, so let's just let them use it. So go ahead, Mr. Fighter, Action Surge, pour those superiority dice into your attacks, have fun, because that's the entire point of this game, is to make a character and actually play the character, not make a character and not use the abilities. Figuring out like the null state is what we're actually like training for. So that's my thoughts on challenge rating, fundamentally why I don't think it works, and why I think the core math of 5e had made a lot of assumptions that turned out to not reflect actual play. And how we ended up with those assumptions, I will say I think one of the issues was, and this is something you see a lot in D&D, that attrition-based play made sense in AD&D, where there was no such thing as a short rest. You would camp overnight and get back 1 hit point. In fact, I think you only got 1 hit point if you rested for 24 consecutive hours. Getting your spells back actually did take time. It wasn't just instant. There was time you had to spend studying after resting. And the number of characters who had expendable resources, I mean, it was just your casters, and that was basically it. So there was an attrition game because the fighter types and like the thief types were going all out every fight, like because they didn't have expendable resources. And the casters really did have to judge and be very careful to shepherd their spells, because you also got a lot fewer of them. It was also a time when the culture of gaming, you didn't have this idea of, I'm going to build a character, and I have like my character's trick that I like to do in combat. The tactics were more based on positioning and control of zones. Like doorway fighting is a big thing in AD&D, like fight in the doorway, so even though there's 20 orcs, only one can attack us at a time, and we can the characters up front can rotate, so if they take a few hits, well, the fighter will step aside and let the ranger step in for a bit, things like that. That's just not how the game is played these days. Just culture that's shifted, and I mean the good news, if you like playing that way, you can play AD&D, right? It's still right there. But I think that was something where it made sense in looking at especially the classic adventures that we're looking at, saying how do these work. That fit in well. The challenge is, that's not really how people play, and I don't really even know. Like, it's interesting to think in terms of adventures. I'd have to go look at some like what's being designed today. But my impression is like adventures tend to be kind of written that way still, but people want to run games that are much more like, hey, every fight is a big deal. And again, I think that kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier. Fights now take longer. The game's gotten more complicated. The baseline complexity of characters has gone up pretty significantly, especially in terms of handling time. And so, okay, if starting a fight means we're committing to an hour, we should really make sure that hour isn't just a test of our ability, our patience, to not just start firing off our limited resources. So that's my little talk for this week. I'll have some bit more details on some of the stuff in Wing of Monsters. Been following along. You've seen some of this stuff before, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk it through and show some of it off. So take care and enjoy the rest of your week. And as always, good gaming.